Sorry if I may interject. How rulers, Islamically at least, should be chosen is that wise people like shuyukh and people that have an understanding of how governments should work are those that are supposed to put the ruler in place, rather than a democracy in what we think of as in voting for people. So I think that should be known within this debate.
And do you Sean, hang on. Before we establish whether that's the case or not, Sulzabeh, do you agree with that principle? It's not a problem if you do. I'm just wondering.
Yeah, I do agree with it because that's how it should be Islamically. But also, as we've seen, at least in the West and in Brexit as well, and voting for what's his name, Boris Johnson. I don't think the public are really fit to put people in power, especially when they don't have the correct.
Well, I think Amal should definitely jump in here. I was just waiting for the right moment to compliment you on your Bernie Sanders pick, but
Thank
you. You look.
I was going to say something about that. Sorry. I was going to say that just sounds quite elitist. Like, it's really easy for us to say, oh, the public don't know what they want when they vote for someone that, like, obviously we don't agree with. And that's quite dangerous when you think you know, like, more than the general public, if you know what I mean.
Alhamdulillah. Well, the sound of reason from Bradford.
I was saying that many campaigns have spread false information, and that if the public were to vote again, they'd vote in a different way. And I don't think the public are educated enough to make such a big decision. And I think that's where Islam has kind of erased that margin of error by making sure that educated people and people who are Islamically knowledgeable are able to put
the thing is as well,
in place to run a country.
The thing is as well, like, now we live in multicultural societies, like, we don't just have Muslims. So I'd find it quite hard for someone, like, for example, say you're an atheist or you're a Christian, to, like, sort of give up their right to vote because of an Islamic scholar.
Yeah, I understand that. I'm talking about Libya's situation because this is a Gaddafi debate.
Well, Amal, I pose you a thought experiment, just kind of build on what you're saying, that because there are the other notions of democracy, and there are people who have said that maybe it shouldn't be automatic, the right to vote, that once you get to the age of 18 or 16 or some arbitrary number, that just how I think if you were to kind of try and look at the concept of shura, rule by council or democracy through a more modern lens, you could say that people have to have a citizenship exam, or they have to show a basic understanding of politics, philosophy, and things like that before they're allowed to vote. I mean, you could argue that people have to have a basic competency, or, there are lots of ways around that problem, but it's quite abstract.
Yeah, I agree with that.
But in terms of that, would also solve the problem, Amal's problem, there being different religious groups, because you could have that some kind of universal test or tailor it to different communities. But then you look at countries like Lebanon, and Oz, you were talking about Lebanon recently.
Yeah.
Sorry, Sam, Omar.
Here's an interesting question for the panel, especially the two sisters who got involved just in interchange. Would your opinions on Gaddafi have changed if he had taken power and then signed up to the Sanusi Tariqa and became a muqaddam of the Sanusis? Or what I'm saying is basically, what if Gaddafi was a strongman, but instead of a socialist strongman, he was an Islamist strongman?
Sorry, could you clarify about what you mean by that?
The question is, would your opinions on Gaddafi have changed if, say, for argument's sake, he wasn't a socialist strongman, but he was an Islamist strongman? So say his whole history was the same, but instead of supporting like left-wing groups or liberation groups across the world, he was supporting Islamist groups across the world. Would your opinions on him, not specifically just for that, but say he was just like number one head honcho, but his policies were Islamist, like, however you want to define that.
I mean,
broad definition.
My main problems aren't with his policies, although like I disagree with some of them. My main problems with like how the policies were carried out and how like literally, he killed people doing them and people were hung for disagreeing with him. So even if he was an Islamist and he, literally killed people to get his way, I'd still disagree with him.
I think also if he was an Islamist, then he wouldn't have done the atrocities that he has done. Because he would be following the correct Sharia. which obviously I would agree with because I'm Muslim.
That's a lot of people are corrupt these days as well, though, you'll find. So it's sort of Islam, but tailored to them, like Islam.
But okay, but don't you find yourself falling into the whole no true Scotsman fallacy when we say, oh, if he was an Islamist, he wouldn't have done this? Because obviously we know, and we're all very aware that people who take on that title have done heinous crimes. Of course, we would take issue with their identification of Islamists, but nevertheless, they still self-identify as that and commit those kind of acts.
I mean, like, as you said, if he wasn't a socialist and instead branded himself as an Islamist, but still did the same atrocities, of course I wouldn't support him, because, you know, you hear about these stories where he'd literally go to schools and pick out girls that he'd want them to take for him, and I think that's absolutely disgusting. And that, you know, obviously I don't think anyone here would agree with what Gaddafi has done over the years. I mean, broadcasting hangings is just not something that I don't think any self-righteous person would stand for.
Yeah, and all the young men's lives that he wasted in like a pointless war in Chad just so he could get more power. I wouldn't agree with him even if he was like an Islamist. Like, even if the title changed, his actions are still wrong. If that makes sense.
Who mentioned,
yeah, definitely makes sense. Yeah.
Who mentioned was it you said, Sabah, that said if he was an Islamist, then he'd be following Sharia, and therefore his rule he wouldn't make errors in his rule. Was that yourself?
Yeah, I think what I meant by that, I'll clarify what I meant, is that if he was a true Islamist and if he did truly rule what obviously Sayyidina Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam instructed us to rule, then I think that he wouldn't have made the same mistakes, but of course he did. So
fine. But do you agree that it's difficult for mere mortals like ourselves or anyone or Gaddafi, whatever, to determine exactly an objective Sharia, how Sharia was intended to be implemented? Do you agree that there is difficulty in establishing what is supposed to be implemented according to Islam? There is an element of subjectivity that comes into play.
Oh,
right?
yeah, of course, like 100%. I don't think anyone can get it 100% right, or else, you know, they would be close to the Prophet, which, you know, isn't going to happen. So yeah, I definitely think there is margin for error. But if rulers, especially in Islamic countries, strive to be, you know, the perfect ruler, of course they can't quite get to that, then there would be less, you know.
Sean, sorry, Sean, just one last question, then I'll shut up. Yeah.
No, carry on.
Yeah, one last question. So is part of your opposition to Gaddafi the fact that he was secular? Well, that's debatable, but let's assume that you have that opinion. Is that part of your opposition?
Yes and no. Like, of course, I would want Libya to be like a good Islamic country, but at the same time, the atrocities that he's done is what makes me, you know, against Gaddafi. I don't think it's right what he's done, and he was a dictator and he killed his people so he could stay in power. So yes and no, I think, if that's okay.
This is why we need, on the Sharia point, we need a deliberative process, because no one person can really get it right. I think if you look at the examples of the early caliphs, I don't remember which caliph righteously guided it was, but there was an anecdote that really struck me first time I heard it, because of my own background, my Jewish background, which was one of the four rightly guided was convening a sort of public meeting, and then a Jewish woman came out of the audience and kind of challenged him very publicly and a little bit rudely, and then he actually conceded the point. He said she was correct, and he changed his decision because of that challenge. And I think people who have that kind of spirit within them, they will tolerate criticism, and it goes back to our earlier point, doesn't it? People who can listen to other people, even to your most fierce critic, it shows great strength of character. But, yeah.
Ziria, did you want to, because I know you've got quite a few opinions on secularism, Sharia, and in Arab politics. Did you want to touch up on anything that was said in the discussion?
Yeah, I think I would contend that Gaddafi wasn't secular. I would argue that he synthesized some type of Islamic socialism. I think you can find that in a lot of his writings, where he makes no bones about that. He makes no bones about his Islam. He, for example, you know, the classic definition of secularism is a separation of religion and state, or religion and church, or church and state, I should say. And more broadly, it's kind of removing religion from the public sphere. I think Gaddafi was, he didn't make no bones about praying, for example. He didn't make any bones about showing people that he prayed, and like public displays of religion is what I'm saying. And I don't, as far as I know, of course, I've heard what I've heard, anecdotes about scholars being rounded up and whatnot, but it's very difficult to confirm or deny these anecdotal type of reports. However, I haven't heard or I haven't seen, like, for example, mosques being shut down or any type of. The point is, why I don't think it's secular is because he made overtures towards Islam. As I say, he synthesized an Islamic socialism as far as my reading of him goes. And with regards to kind of secularism as a concept in outside of Europe, I think there's something to be said. I would like wider participation in the panel on this point. If we say that as Muslims, we need to be convinced, as in, to be a true Muslim, you need to be convinced. You can't be pressured or forced into practicing Islam or identifying as a Muslim. We all believe that you can't be pressured into it, right? So how then can we envisage a state which has the trappings of religion and says what is orthodox, what is not orthodox, and basically is the arbiter, of that?
Yeah, I was definitely thinking about that as well, because it's kind of hard as well when you bring religion into it. Say you had like a Muslim leader, when someone else would disagree with them and they'd bring Islam into it, and it'd be like a really like a massive argument, because obviously we all interpret things differently. And if it's something like, oh, you're going against Allah, and it could cause so many arguments, because religion is such a personal thing. So sometimes you should distance it slightly from politics. But maybe I'm being too liberal about that. I don't know.
Yeah, I think that's very true. But also in really obvious areas of Islam where it's explicitly said, you know, if you do this, then you're going against Islam. I think it's fair to say.
Like also, what? Give us an example.
Like, for example, not praying. You know, Allah has instructed us to pray. If you don't pray, then you're going against the commandments of Allah. I think that's... Is
it really a government's job to enforce that? I think that should be up to...
No, I'm not saying that. I don't think it's the government's job to enforce it. I'm just giving you an example of where it's explicitly said in Islam. But sorry, what my main point was, my sister, like she let me know that even in Gaddafi's rule, he even tried to change the Quran as well to fit his ideals. Yeah. You know, he's done.
Where though? I mean, where can we find it?
Sorry?
Was it Surah Al-Ikhlas?
I'm not sure the specific surah, but he has tried to, you know, change the Quran, which of course didn't work. But you know, he's tried to do many things like that.
So Ziria, the accusation, I've heard this before. The accusation is that in Surah Al-Ikhlas, it says, Qul huwa Allahu ahad. So say God is one, right? Or self-sufficient. Mm-hmm. And then when he read it out loud, he wouldn't say Qul in the beginning. He would say Allahu ahad, because God has said to him, you,
Allahu ahad.
Allahu ahad.
Right.
Yeah. So
okay. No, I'm familiar. Okay, now you've refreshed my memory. So as far as I've heard, it's a position that he had perhaps in the 80s or 90s, where he said, you know, all of these say is obviously is for the Prophet, peace be upon him, and we're not the Prophet, peace be upon him. So I get it. I think he kind of reverted from that, and there's and why I say that is because there's places you can find videos of him reciting the Quran as it's been revealed on that. But in terms of changing it, I don't know if it's changing in the sense of, say, it's not as though he said this isn't in the. Anyway, I don't need to speak for him. Anyways, but I get the point. I don't think that. I mean, the other thing is Saddam Hussein supposedly wrote the Quran in his own blood. Do you know what I mean? But it's like, yeah, obviously, that probably isn't all his blood, is it? Really?
I just want to propose another hypothetical here, and that I don't think just because you have an Islamic or Islamic inspired government that you have to impose Islamic norms on the entire population. Because if you look at, again, the constitution of Medina, there was, I think, a certain amount of leniency or flexibility granted to religious minorities and a certain amount of self-government. It doesn't make sense to impose Islamic norms on. How do you? You can't deny the nature of the world. There are people of different religious groups, and they have to sometimes live alongside each other. And any government that was Islamic or styled itself as Islamic, but at the same time was trying to impose its norms on non-Muslim people, that's a guaranteed recipe for strife, isn't it? So how do you? I think we're getting a bit off topic, because that's a pretty big topic.
Well, okay, no, let's link this.
I agree with that. Yeah.
Fine. Let's link to Gaddafi then, right? Sorry, Asil, did you want to say something? Okay, so let's link it back to Gaddafi. So Salsabel, when Ziryab said to you, Gaddafi, that he believes Gaddafi was an Islamist leader insofar as he tried to institutionalize an Islamic take on socialism. Also in the name, obviously the name, whatever it was called, the Islamic Socialist Republic of Libya or whatever, it's clear that he tried to institutionalize Islam in the state. Would your argument against Gaddafi then be that you believe that he misunderstood what governance was according to Islam?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I don't agree with Ziryab's, point of view where he tried to, implement Islam in his socialist kind of campaigns. So I don't really think that was the case. He didn't really come across as religious. He tried to appeal to some people by, including a few religious statements here and there. But I don't think that was a part of, one of the core parts of his campaign. I think he tried to appeal to people from a socialist background rather than from an Islamic background. So I think that's what I would say.
This is one of the rare times where I disagree with you, Salsabel, because I think Gaddafi branded himself in different ways at different times. So at one point he was, the humble kind of tribal leader that branded himself as somebody that would take advice from leaders of different Qaba'il, from different tribes, right? Another point, he branded himself in this Pan-African way. So, for example, when he wore the kandura with the African map on it and was attending, he ramped up his African summit meetings at that stage. Then at another point, he branded himself in the Pan-Arab way, then in the Pan-Islamic way. I get the impression that his branding had changed throughout his presidency.
Yeah. Well, I think also a part of my standpoint comes from not even just the Libyan community, but also the wider African community and what they think of Gaddafi. And of course, other African countries, excluding North African countries, believe that Gaddafi was, the forefront of Africa. He was doing all these amazing different things, and that wasn't